Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Moscow. Today a very interesting article was published by the Times. The Trump will not be able to create peaceful conditions that Putin will agree to. The president of Russia allegedly wants to make Ukraine a satellite country. Russia supposedly does not fight for the territory. Ukraine cannot be a realist neutral state. The problem for the security of Russia is the very fact of the existence of such a state as Ukraine. Russia does not have illusions about the fact that Trump will restore relations unlike 2017. Although the US president is not able to complete the conflict in Ukraine on the terms that arrange Putin, some believe that Washington's readiness to ignore international norms can play in the hands of Moscow. Another important article was published by the Turkish media that are close to Erdogan, the president of Turkey. Negotiations to end the war in Ukraine are expected in April-May, before which a ceasefire will be announced. It is expected that a peace negotiating table will be set up in April-May, which will put an end to the Russian-Ukrainian war. A roadmap is allegedly being created now. First, a ceasefire will be announced, then the sanctions against Russia will be reviewed. That was stated by the article. Very interesting situation, because when talking, for example, about Zelensky himself, we see that he is not ready to finish the conflict. Putin must be put in his place so that there are no more wars, Zelensky stated. If a person understands that he carries the evil of the world and the world punishes for it and evil loses, then he will think twice about starting a war. So we see such statements obviously don't make the situation better. Such statements makes the situation much worse. For example, the Ukrainians are completely disagree with Zelensky, with their president. According to information we have, almost 70% of the Ukrainians want an immediate cessation of the firing, 20 freezing the lines, and 50 negotiating at the end to the war. Furthermore, as we discussed currently, the main idea and the main purpose of war for Ukraine is its resources. The sources reported that the Russians have already established complete control over 14.8 trillion of resources, and obviously this is a very big number. Obviously the Western countries understand the further the Russians are moving in the Western direction, the less it will remain for them. So as for now, it's better for them to stop the conflict, maybe even to make Ukraine as a satellite state of Russian Federation, but just to save their rights for the property the Western countries and Western Investment Fund have already purchased on the territory of Ukraine. I'm talking about land, and I'm talking about other different things. Now let's discuss the situation in Europe. We have a lot of very interesting updates. As I'll remind you that these days Zelensky came to Poland for anniversary, and during his meeting there were a lot of statements made in Poland by the different authorities. For example, the Poles are saying that gas pipelines from Russia should be dismantled, so the Germans are not intrigued to use them later. So that was the statement made by the authorities of Poland. Very interesting. Duda, president of Poland, stated that the gas flow from Russia to Western Europe should never be restored, even if Russia and Ukraine reach a peace agreement. This is a very important statement, and this is obviously an attack not even on Russia. This is an attack in the direction of Germany. But when talking about Germany, most likely Germany found some solution, and this is very important. It's a piece of news. For example, today we got update that Volkswagen will allow Chinese electric car makers to take over production line at its factories. So we see that this is very important. This is a very important signal to the United States of America, because we see that China is taking Germany in their sphere of influence. Several more important updates are coming from the Baltic states. According to information we have, Denmark says it will spend 2.1 billion to boost its military presence in the Arctic amid Trump's interest in controlling Greenland. That was stated by Reuters. Furthermore, we got very interesting updates from the Baltic states itself. Under the pressure from Trump, Lithuania and Estonia have become the first NATO members to commit to raising their defense budgets to 5% of GDP. But when talking about these Baltic states, they have the reason to increase the spendings because since the beginning of autumn of 2024 or even earlier, there were a lot of cases when somebody or some site were damaging and destroying the cables, let's say, that goes above the surface of the Baltic Sea. And for example, today we got another report that the Swedish Security Service has detained a ship in the Baltic Sea on suspicion of damaging a cable. That might be unexpected, but the ship is again linked to Russia. So that's why the Baltic states are interested in increasing their budgets in NATO, because they want this area to be secured. And now let's discuss the most important updates that are coming from the United States of America. According to information we have, biggest market loss in history. Nvidia stock shows nearly 600 billion as Chinese DeepSeek shakes AI darling. You know, I have installed and I start using this DeepSeek AI system. I used to work with ChatGPT, but you know, ChatGPT has one big problem for the Belarusian region. There are sanctions and we can't use the system. This is the only problem. So that's why DeepSeek doesn't have any problems with this. I start using this without any problems, and I understand that millions of people from Russia, from the former USSR region, from CR region, will start using this system. And of course, this is a very powerful competitor to the United States of America. So let's wait and see what is going to be next. But the sources are saying that the US stock market has lost 1 trillion in value just per one day. Let's wait and see, because this might be the beginning of something very, very bad in the United States of America and in the world, of course, as well. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground in Ukraine, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. It's very difficult to understand what exactly is happening in the settlement of Velika Novoselovka, but the Russians are saying that Ukrainians that were encircled by the Russians dropped their equipment, dropped their uniform, dropped their weapon. They took civilians' clothes, and then tried to say that there are civilians from the settlement of Velika Novoselovka. So that's why the Russians, there are lots of job ahead of the Russians. They need to check every single building, and they need to check every single person to understand whether he is a former Ukrainian soldier or he is indeed a civilian from this territory. So that's why only after this process the Russians will be able to move further in the north and the northwestern directions. As for the Andreevka fortified area, during the previous 24 hours, according to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the southern part of the settlement of Dvorichna. We see that the Russians are just trying to outflank the settlement and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. Just the regular things that we used to see during the previous phases of the special military operation. Now let's discuss the situation in the Dnipro direction. During the previous 24 hours, the map was updated, as you can see. The Russians took under control around 75% of the settlement of Novoandreevka. The Russians, as we can see, were attacking from the east, and the Russians took under control several tree lines in the western direction from the settlement of Slavyanka, trying to outflank the Ukrainians in the Andreevka fortified area. Huge progress, by the way. We see that most likely the Ukrainians were forced to fall back from this territory due to significant gap and problems with soldiers and servicemen, so they can't hold their lines. Basically, the only thing the Ukrainians can do during this winter period of time to hold the lines in the settlements. But this situation plays obviously in Russian favor, because now the Russians can maneuver through the fields and so encircle this or that settlement. Very interesting updates are coming from the Pokrovsk direction. From one side, the Russians managed to improve their positions, and we got geolocations that confirm the presence of the Russian Federation, the territory of the southeastern part of Dvorichna. We came to this conclusion based on the video published by the 155th Mechanized Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine. So basically, we have colored the territories that used to be in contested area. Now we have no doubts that the Russians have their presence on the territory of the settlement. On the other side, during the previous 24 hours, 48 hours, the Ukrainians carried out the second attempt to counterattack the Russian units to the south of Kotlina, and as we can see, as a result of this counterattack, the Ukrainians managed to take under control significant territories, and now we see that the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack. This is very interesting. These are the first counterattacks probably in this direction carried out by the Ukrainians that are more or less successful. I'll remind you that yesterday the Ukrainians, for example, counterattack, or at least we got yesterday geolocations that confirmed counterattacks carried out by the Ukrainians in the Torietsk direction. Now we see Ukrainians counterattacks in the area of Kotlina. The main purpose of these counterattacks is to force the Russians to slow down, to stop them, and not to allow the Russians to develop their offensive operation in the western directions towards the border with the Dnipro region. Anyway, we have adjusted the map based on the video that was published by the Ukrainian side. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 27th of January. This is the situation by the beginning of the 28th of January. If the Ukrainians are able to advance further in the western direction like this, then most likely they will be able to encircle the Russians who are currently located on the territory of Kotlina, and this might be a very huge disaster. Of course, the Russians will not allow the Ukrainians to do this, but who knows whether the Russians are able to do this, because during the previous days, months of endless offensive operations, the Russians suffered significant losses. Now let's discuss the situation in the Torietsk direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russian sources published the video of how they were FPV droning and attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine in the pocket between the settlement of Torietsk and the settlement of Sherbinovka. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map in Ukraine's favor. I'll remind you that several weeks ago, some neutral mappers, as I remember, colored this territory in Russian favor, but now we see that most likely those were just speculations. Now let's discuss the situation in the city of Chasiv Yar. During the previous 24 hours, we got lots of very important updates. And first, let's talk about the southern direction. According to information we have, the Russians managed to secure the forest completely. This is very important. The Russians managed to take these territories under complete control, and this means that the Russians are about to begin offensive operation in the direction of Shevchenko Black micro-district, and the Russians can attack the central citadel from behind. So anyway, if this information is correct, then most likely we can start counting days before the Ukrainian positions on the territory of the central citadel falls. Interesting details are coming from the northern part. Today, different pro-Russian resources adjusted their maps in Ukrainian favor, and according to information we have, the Ukrainians maybe during the previous days managed to carry out successful counterattacks, and they restored control over the micro-district of Desyata and Novopivnichny. So this is the third area where the Ukrainians counterattacked, and another counterattack was more or less successful. So once again, summarizing everything, we see the Ukrainians are counterattacking in the area of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians counterattacked in the area of the city of Torietsk, and now the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack in the area of the city of Chasiv Yar. And we see that Ukrainians, as a result of those three counterattacks, managed to restore positions they lost during the Russian offensives. Very interesting situation, by the way. Now let's discuss the situation in the Liman direction. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Novosadova. As for the northern Kupiansk direction, during the previous 24 hours, the most important updates came from the Dvorichna area. As you can see, we have adjusted the map. We have colored additional, let's say, contested area. We have added additional contested area in the most northwestern part of the settlement. According to pro-Russian resources, as a result of offensive operation, the armored forces of Russian Federation managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Dvorichna. And this happened because the Russians managed to restore the pontoon bridges on some roads along the river of Oskol, and starting on the 27th of January, the Russians got possibilities to redeploy heavy tanks, armored vehicles on this side of the river. The Russians were mainly attacking the Ukrainian positions here just with infantry and FPV drones, and starting on the 27th of January, the Russians began using tanks and armored vehicles, which obviously will intensify the Russian offensive operation in this area, and obviously this can lead to significant progress from the Ukrainian side. During the previous night, the Russians carried out another massive drone attack all over the entire territory of Ukraine. We had several explosions on the territory of Kharkiv, and there were several explosions on the territory of Kiev. We are waiting for additional details what exactly exactly the Russians were attacking. As for the Sudzha direction, during the previous 24 hours, the Russian sources published several more videos of fiber optic drones attack on Ukrainian tanks and vehicles that took place on the territory of the settlement of Sverdlikova and on the territory of the settlement of Cherkasskaya, Polechna and Nikolskaya. So we know that there are very heavy clashes on the territory of every single settlement we've just discussed, so most likely we should expect for additional updates from the ground in the very near future, because the Russians are attacking the Ukrainian forces here, and they should start the ground operation as well. So soon the Sudzha direction, the map over the Sudzha direction will be adjusted. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.